This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Before we get started, I just wanted to share some great news with Robert and Catherine and anyone who might not have heard the announcement. Previously, we've got a subscriber, Lauren Enterprises, so thank you so much. Yay! And anyone can support us at storyworkspodcast.com. So thanks again to Lauren Enterprises. Now, tonight we are talking about evoking emotion, and this comes from a listener question from Amy. So this, I think, is an interesting question because there are two pieces to it that we can unpack. And the first piece is showing your character's emotional states on the page, but then the second piece, and maybe the more critical piece here, is how do we get the reader to feel that along with the character? So we're evoking that emotion in the reader through the experience of reading and moving through the story with the character. So have you guys given evoking emotion much thought? Is it something you are concerned with when you write?
No, I don't care about it. Just get the bangs and the explosions and guns, who cares about all that?
Right. Isn't that just for character-driven fiction?
Yeah, it's literary stuff, that emotional thing, isn't it? No, yeah, of course.
Catherine is shaking her head.
I think it's a tough one. I think sometimes you don't realize when you're new to writing how little emotional experience can come through, because it's so much of our initial story writing maybe is throat clearing. It varies from person to person, but you listen to podcast after podcast of interviews with authors, and they'll so many will say, look, the first 3 books I wrote, that's never going to see the light of day, or even though this was my debut novel, it was actually my 6th that was purchased, or all those stories. And I suspect largely it's because of many things, but maybe when you read back it, they don't do anything for you. And if we say something doesn't do anything for me, what I suspect we're really saying is there's no stimulation. And since stimulation is probably directly connected to our emotional responses or reactions to a story, then therein lies the issue. And like you said, I think it's twofold. It's both prose and structure. We can have gorgeous prose that has us living the life of the main character, but if nothing much happens, it's tricky to evoke any real sensational responses in the reader's brain, I think, anyway. So yeah, definitely from reading back over my first drafts, I've read it and think, oh, that's really lame and limp. And I think as a new author, you don't necessarily know what to do to fix that or why it's reading that way. And then you inevitably step across the first, but show, don't tell, and, okay, right, well, how do I do that? So then I have my characters all, feeling and wondering and thinking, and surely that's showing, isn't it? No, apparently that's not showing either. So I think it's quite hard to evoke emotion in prose. Anyway, There's my rant.
It is hard. Catherine, do you want to address that opening question?
I agree with Robert. It is hard. I feel like this is one of those things that kind of like theme when we were talking about that too. Like sometimes this happens without you consciously realizing it's happening in terms of evoking emotions in your reader. And I think a lot of it has to do with how deep into your character you are when you're writing it. Because if you're really just skimming the surface of your character's emotions, then your reader's not going to care either. Whereas if you're really deep in and everybody's feeling exactly what the character's feeling, then you can really push that level of emotion in your reader as well.
Right. Definitely. So one thing we need to do as writers is show, don't tell. And the other thing we need to do is go deep into your character's emotions. And I think those are two critical elements we've already hit on.
Yeah, because I think that show don't tell piece is really important, because when you have something that's oversimplified, you're telling.
Mm-hmm.
You over explain the emotions don't hit as hard. That's kind of, you go around it too many times because you're telling everything, then there's nothing for us to feel.
Right. And if anyone isn't solid on the difference between show versus tell, we've done several episodes on this. We'll link to them in the show notes. And, I think key here to going deep into your character's emotions is finding a way to create that emotion both on and off the page for your reader. You can't just say she felt sad or tears rolled down her cheek. That isn't going to make your reader feel. Even if you're showing the sadness with the tears, we have to understand why it's sad. We have to have been going on the journey to the sadness with the character. We have to be engaged in the storyline, in the plot and the thematic elements to such an extent that we're feeling along with the character. And as writers, this is one of those difficult, intangible things that's really hard to explain and hard to do, but it's also thrilling when you accomplish it. My first experience with this was in high school, and I had written a play as a senior and then produced it, directed it as a night of senior plays. So there were 3 or 4 plays there. And I went backstage and I heard the audience laugh, and I heard the audience gasp, and I heard the hush when something sad happened. And it's, as writers, we don't get that. As novelists, we don't get that. We aren't sitting next to our readers watching them for reactions. But that's the goal. The goal is to create that effect in your reader. And so our writing has to affect them. It has to be moving. Right. So the big question, of course, is how? How do we do that? Round table?
Well, I suppose, I think if you're following, some of the basic storytelling rules, though, first, then, if you've got a character who wants something, who can't get it because of some kind of conflict, and it's a believable thing that they want, and maybe underneath that there's some driving inner issues for that character, and there's a consistent series of setbacks leading towards a major story goal that then ends up having the character arc. You've got the basic skeleton of what you can then dress with, hopefully something that's a believable circumstance that transports the reader in, that then becomes up to your prose, and the prose might take several run-throughs for that to get, as you say, those gasps or those what the moments, and it's definitely, I think you can read your own stuff sometimes and kind of have a little wry smile and go, oh, okay, I quite like that. Without the sort of being totally attached to it, without the sort of reading going, oh, that was brilliant. I don't mean from a technical writing point of view, but I think if you can start to experience that yourself, certainly from my point of view, I will read my probably second or third drafts on the Kindle or on the Kindle app on the iPad. And that helps because then I'm placing myself firmly, in a reader's position. Right. And that, most of the time I'm reading with a critical eye or ear. So it's not a fantastic experience, but you definitely start to feel that, okay, this needs more lift here, or this shift in that character's emotions. All of a sudden they went from really angry to suddenly, deliriously happy. What? How did that happen? It's not believable. So I think, that helps as well, is distancing yourself from your own work.
Yeah, distancing yourself absolutely helps. And, reading it as a reader or hearing it, if you have someone, if you have your computer play it back to you, I find that even on the, especially on the 3rd or 4th draft, I can feel sort of numb to the emotions I'm trying to create because I've spent so much time and mental processing, creating the effects, pulling the strings, being the puppet master for my character and my readers, that I then don't, feel it myself. So when I am ready to give my manuscript to a friend to read, someone I can have an actual conversation with, then I always ask them, what were your favorite parts? How did you feel? What about this? And I can, it's not just like an email form with beta readers. I can actually pick their brains and get that feedback loop going and try to find the weaknesses and the strengths of what was moving. So besides distancing and then using beta feedback, so distancing yourself and using yourself as the reader, and then getting beta feedback, something really helpful here is remembering that we need to structure in the elements that are going to lead to the emotional payoff. So for example, I was just working on a manuscript today, and this writer has given me permission to talk about him. He had, in the epilogue, the point of view character saying, he and Sarah have become close, right? And then he and Sarah have shared experiences they have, and we're being told about this thing, which narrative summary works well in epilogues, but he then had the protagonist discover that Sarah had died. And because they didn't have a deep relationship during the book, her death and its emotional impact was reliant on this narrative summary of they had become close, they had shared experiences, and so it was flat for the reader. Her death became, no big deal, don't really care. So as writers, what we need to do is say, okay, I want this to be effective. I want to affect my reader. Therefore, I need to build up to it with the appropriate events, relationships, built into the structure, so that when we get to the big event, like the death in this case, the reader feels for Sarah and for the protagonist and says, oh, that's a loss, instead of, okay, another character's dead, no big deal.
Right. I think you can see this as moments of tension and release.
Yeah.
Because if you're, and it doesn't have to be like bad tension.
Right.
You can build up to where you want your reader to feel really happy. You still can like wind that emotional tension so that when you get to that happy point and everything kind of releases, your reader feels that along with the character.
Yes.
Otherwise, like you're saying, if there's no lead up, if there's no reason for us to care, then we aren't going to. But you can do this with like mood setting, or the way that characters are talking to each other, or like the anticipation of something else that they know is coming, but they don't maybe know exactly what it is. But having that built in throughout, subtext and all of that really helps to create that moment, tension, release, suspense kind of type thing. They don't know what they're suspended from until they hit that emotional release that you want to trigger for them.
Yeah, that's a great point. I love the idea of winding up the story, the character, and the reader as well, like a turnkey on a, and then it starts going. We get that release of the spring there.
And we do this in a lot of elements of stories, whether it's our scene winding up to the, release after the combat. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But you can do it in so many different ways, and having the same kind of feeling of we're moving towards this, and then that way your reader is primed and ready to feel that emotion.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point there, Catherine, that it's not it can be described as a mechanical thing, but the way you described it is you described it as increasing a feeling. So it's because it's easy to say, well, it's because I was thinking about this, it's like a structure of, it's like a joke. A joke is a release of emotion that is delivered with a sudden twist, and if it's delivered well, then we laugh, and if it isn't, then we don't, or we groan. And I guess at the end of the day, that's a snapshot of what we're trying to do with fiction in terms of delivering emotion. Are we looking to evoke tears, laughter, shock, sadness, grief, whatever. And if we're heavy-handed with it, then people will just groan. But if it's too mechanical, then it won't land. So, like a joke that's told by a comedian who's told it 100 times before, it just, if they're bored with it, then the audience are going to be bored with it. So I think you've got to somehow put. It's back to that horrible old thing of, walking in your character's shoes and trying to react and respond the way she or he will. And then finding ways to write that aren't heavy-handed and that work within the structure of your story. So, that's why I go back to saying it's hard. It's not,
Right. And the other thing to keep in mind, too, is that your character has a journey along an arc, and so whatever your character's reaction is to the event, whether happy or tragic or whatever, it has to work within the story's frame and within the frame of that character arc. So with this manuscript today, the character's reaction to the death was something I had seen before throughout the book, but it was in the epilogue. It was at the very end of his arc. And so, I said to the writer, you need to give us a different reaction here. It can't be the same one we've already seen because your character has gone through the evolution process of his arc. He's a more mature hero now. He's, grown into his boots, so to speak. So you can make that death more poignant than the previous deaths by changing the reaction. And the reader could have a lot of could even have more feeling than the character because the reader is in the subtext and is seeing the larger meaning of it. So if your character's been desensitized by death, and then here's this real tragic one at the end, but he's stoic instead of weeping, the reader can be sad for both the death and for the protagonist who's now changed, right? So that's another layer of structuring your story that we need to think about as readers, because pulling your character strings as writers, because pulling your character's strings and pulling your reader's strings, you aren't always pulling the same strings. In that case, the character goes stoic and we want the reader to feel bereft.
Right, like they've lost something, like the character has lost something and that makes them feel sad. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So don't keep bouncing backwards and forwards on the same. I suppose, again, that's if we talk about a one-dimensional character, then we're saying, one-dimensional characters not only typically do the same things, but they typically have the same reactions and responses, and perhaps also they typically don't have much of an arc, if at all.
Right.
So what you're really saying there is to make the character more than one-dimensional. That's where we're going to start showing changes in emotional responses relevant to the arc and relevant to the story's plot.
Yes, exactly. I mean, Sherlock Holmes is the archetype for the arcless protagonist, and we don't really feel along with Sherlock because he is so flat and so stoic and so cerebral about everything. But we can feel with Watson. Watson can provide us the emotional relief that Sherlock doesn't, so we can love Sherlock and be fascinated by him. But he's not going to take us on the same kind of emotional journey as a more human, character with an arc. And so that's why if you write the arcless protagonist, you need the sidekick to give us that entree into the humanity of the story.
Right, yeah. Or the setting or the antagonist to be the driver of the reader's emotions, I suppose. Or the victim. Yeah.
So I think I know you want to evoke your reader's emotions throughout your entire book. You want your reader to be invested in, to feel along with your character. But in terms of like those major emotion moments, like you don't want to overdo that or do it too often. I really hate it when I feel like the book is trying, like especially if it's like a tearjerker. I don't want to cry every chapter. Like that's just going to frustrate me and I'm not going to finish the book. You know what I mean? So like don't overuse
Yes.
Your emotional moment. Like, it's okay
Yes.
for your reader to be like, oh, that was sad. Like, I feel sad, but don't like get them weeping until that one, the one time that you want them to weep.
And you can say that of any aspect of story writing. Don't overdo anything. Don't browbeat your reader, because it becomes tedious instead of effective. And just as your plot elements have an arc that rises to the climax of the story, your emotional journey should follow that similar trajectory. So maybe, the saddest moment is toward the midpoint when, the protagonist's child or spouse is killed or something like that. That might be when you're weeping, but still the emotional high point might be when the vengeance is fulfilled or whatever at the climax. Right. So you've got a lot of different emotions to work with and a lot of different story elements, but we want the emotions to vary and to crest the same way the plot arc does.
Right. You want them to pull your reader along rather than pushing them out of the story.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is where I have a tendency to do melodramatic moments and thinking that's the same thing as emotional peaks. And I have to go and correct that often. And I'm not saying I'm perfect. They're probably still there, but you have to go and correct them when I'm revising, because a reader go, oh no, that's just too. That's really heavy-handed. That is. And then
Did we just enter a soap opera?
That's it. Right? Yeah, that's right. Well, all my first drafts read like a soap opera, so that's fair enough.
Why not? There you go.
But I think and therein lies the clue, doesn't it? Because if we think about soap operas, that they're heavy-handed at driving the emotion. They do try and jerk the tears at exactly the right moment.
Yes.
They are going to build up to a melodramatic emotional moment just before the ad. So it's all timed and carefully calculated. And what they miss is subtlety. And I was just thinking that also the other way that we as writers can really get a deft hand at the evocative elements of emotion is with real subtlety. I mean, it can be just a look held a few seconds longer. It could be the way somebody's lips formed. It could be a word that they just took slightly too long to say, or a word they've never said before. So, that doesn't often come for me anyway in first draft moments, unless I'm having one of those flow states. So it is when you go back and you go, well, that's an awful sentence. Let me tidy that up. And you tidy it up. And as you're tidying it up, you think, oh, that's nice. Oh, okay, that's how I can get her to, to sort of, appear doing such and such or whatever it is. So I think, it's important not to drive yourself nuts with it, because it's a process of sculpting, and again, assuming our bare bones have got some sense of arc and story to it.
Yeah, and I think this is a great point, Robert, because while we do want to hit emotional peaks and pull our readers' strings, we do not want to hit melodrama, and subtlety and nuance and subtext is critical to that. So often the most emotional moments are quiet moments. They aren't big explosive moments. They aren't the screaming fight. It's I wrote a short story about the end of a woman realizing a relationship had ended, and she had been, I think in the story, she was packing up because she was going to move in with the partner. And when she realizes that that's not going to work, the end note of the story is she takes something out of a box and puts it back. And the emotion, my effort to evoke emotion in the reader doesn't come from her words with the partner, soon to be ex-partner. It doesn't come from anything big. It's just that subtle, all right, reverse, turn this around and try to start over again. So you need to keep that in mind as well, that the dramatic action might peak before the emotion peaks. The emotion often comes afterwards, like if you have a fight with somebody.
Yeah.
You're all caught up in the fight and there's adrenaline and, confusion and whatever feelings. And then you go away and you're like, oh, and you start processing and thinking. And that's when you have time to really feel. So it can be the same way in our stories, the dramatic peak and the emotional peak might be slightly offset from each other.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that was the one thing, again, writing action stories that I used to struggle with is recovery too quickly.
Yeah.
That the emotion would recover at the same time as the physical action would. And then just in pure adrenaline terms, that wouldn't happen.
Right.
Or characters, who are physically wounded don't carry any emotional wounds from it. So they're just, they're just limited physically. But, look, the pain is going to change your thinking. It's going to make you react differently to different people.
Yes.
So there are all those kind of things that, again, I would hesitate to even call it subtext. I think it's just realism.
Yeah. In that case, absolutely. I mean, and we forget about that. We think of continuity just in terms of, okay, bullet wound to the thigh, we limp. But what about, after that wound is healed and the limp is still there, does he now feel like less than a man because he's got a physical deformity or something? Or, you know what I mean? So we have to do that layering for our characters, and then that carries over to the reader, and then we can play it out. Okay, he's got a limp, so what? Well, now a cute woman just smiled at him, but he's embarrassed about his limp, so he turns away instead of smiling back. There's the emotional piece that follows from the physical piece.
You're hard. You're a tough woman. You are. You only limp with a bullet wound to the thigh. There I am.
I could amputate it. What the heck?
Floor by that moment.
Well.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's it. I'm hiking with a leader.
I have my tourniquet ready.
Yeah, thank you. The other thing I think that's tricky about evoking emotion, and you kind of alluded to it a little bit with your story about the epilogue and the sort of delayed emotional impact, is writing the end of a novel. We've taken the reader through a journey, and it can be, for some stories, extraordinarily emotional. And we pull off this incredible climax, and we head into the denouement and whatever, kind of ending you want to have. What do you do then you don't necessarily want to seal? Well, okay, what do you want to do? Do you want to seal everything off neatly? Do you want to leave the reader thinking? Do you want to have them hung on an emotion? I think that for me has always been a tough one of and so many authors don't do it well. Even the big authors, you come to that last paragraph and think, oh, and that's it. Sometimes there's nothing else.
Okay, it's done.
And I know it's different in a movie where you can be left with that sort of magic moment. But it's really hard to do in a novel, and I suspect that's something to do with how we leave the reader emotionally. So anything that you want to talk to about that?
Well, yeah, let's do our next episode on ending stories, but
ending stories emotional.
Or just how to end stories. I mean, it is an interesting point because in film you have music and, montages and all the rest of it to play with the audience's strings, and in books we don't. So how to end it really depends on the story you're telling, the genre, if there's a sequel, if you're going for an ambiguous ending or a tidy resolution, if it's a hopeful ending or a more, resolved but open-ended ending. The key, though, is to have some kind of emotional note, whether it's satisfaction, like, oh, they live happily ever after now, yay, or a hook, like, ooh, look who just walked back into town. Now I've got to see what happens next. Some sense of, completion, but then also, is it hearts and flowers, or is it dun dun dun? Here comes trouble. So, I think we should go into that in a whole other episode, because you could, you could evoke any emotion. It all just depends on
right. Well, I think
the story you're telling.
Just to talk about that evoking emotions thing, you were talking about offsetting it from the climax. I think then that gives you that like emotional resolution kind of right at the end after the climax. You've hit all those plot points. You are, if you're going to crest your emotional arc after your climactic plot driven arc, then you're going to have that emotional moment that you're letting the reader sit in.
Right.
It at the end right there before you finish the story, however you're going to finish it. So, you know, you want to have that resonance happen there, however that works for your story.
Yeah, and you might need to hit several emotional notes, like the celebratory emotion of we defeated the bad guy, and the romantic notion of, okay, now the hero and the heroine get to share a kiss because the drama's finally ended. And the, tearjerker emotion of, but the master teacher died in the climax or whatever. So you, depending on the shape of your story and the shape of your climax, that resolution, you're going to have to take us through tying up those ends, resolving those story threads, and that could be 3+ different emotional notes you're going to hit in different scenes. You know, and then the end one just depends on the story, but it's
That's right.
the thing you're leaving the reader with when they close the cover, so it's the most important one. What do you want to leave your reader with? What feeling do you want your reader to have when they hit the end, your final words?
Right, because there's two things in there, isn't there? There's the emotional payoff that needs to relate to the overall story. And that may still be lingering, because if it's been a fast-paced finish, you're not necessarily going to spend another several thousand words explaining the ending. And there may be no epilogue, so it might be quite sudden. And then you don't necessarily want to leave them with the wrong emotion either. So, we had this dramatic, fight climax, and all of a sudden, he's walking off into the sunset with the girl, and it's love. And it's an action story, and that it doesn't gel. So, as you say, it has to be appropriate somehow to what the intention is as well. As you say, is there a sequel? Is it part of a series? Is it going to be a hook into the next book? Like in the same way that Marvel do with the end of in the credits.
Right.
And that's quite subtle art, I think. Anyway, as you say, we should do an episode entirely on endings, but I just wanted to bring it up in relation to the evoking emotion, because I've been guilty of making endings that are too long. They just, they take
right,
away.
You lose the emotional impact.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, never ramble. In and out.
Speaking of which,
make your exit.
Could go on for a long time on that one. It's really an endless episode, isn't it, on evoking emotion?
Well, not yet. Before we evoke boredom in our listeners, we'll wrap up this episode. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.